The Lars Larson Show.
Well, you're not going to find this happening very often, but the State Department's Counterterrorism Bureau has apologized this week for promoting a controversial Muslim scholar, this is Washington Free Beacon, whose organization has backed Hamas and issued or endorsed a fatwa authorizing the murder of U.S. soldiers in Iraq. I thought we'd talk to Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who's the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith, and president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Dr. Jasser, good to have you back on.
It's always great to be with you, Lars. Thanks for having me back.
Should we believe this apology? Is this sincere?
Well, if it was sincere, they'd rewind back to last July when this same Abdallah Bin Bayyah, who's from Mauritania and is considered a vice president of the Union of Scholars that the Islamic countries tout as their leading scholars, was invited into the White House. And at that time, our organization and a number of others exclaimed how this guy might appear to be moderate because he's anti-Al-Qaeda and anti-militant, but yet is really part of the core ideological mindset of political Islam and Islamism that is anti-American, has endorsed terrorism in Iraq and in Israel, and is really a wolf in sheep's clothing, as many of these imams are, and was brought in by some of the organizations close to the administration that are apologists for the Islamist movement. So I think it was a gotcha moment. They took off the tweet because the CT Bureau said, hold on a sec, this guy's a radicalizer. And they didn't look back and say, wait a minute, we also did the same thing when the White House invited him last summer.
Why is it, do you think, that the White House is so tone deaf to this? Is it they A, don't care, or that they don't understand what this does, when our government agrees to basically share the reputation of the United States government with a guy in I'm trying to say his name, Bin Bayyah's position?
Two things. Number one, they clearly do not want to make the ideological connection between Islamism and the threat to American security and the greatest threat, I think, in the 21st century. They simply want to say it's about violent extremism. Secondly, and probably more cogently, is the fact that the people close to them giving them advice are all part of the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood network in America that are part of that whole network. So they're going to be offering up these type of imams as moderates because they're anti-Al-Qaeda. And we all know that the reason the Brotherhood got very upset with Al-Qaeda was 9/11 outed what their mission was over the 21st century. So, this is those two main reasons are why this administration has always been on the wrong side of every conflict in the Middle East.
But how can they believe that you can fight this and effectively say we're not going to pay any attention to the religious ideology and cultural ideology of Islamism that is behind the extremism? Because otherwise, on that basis, the IRA, and the people who did necklacing in South Africa and Al-Qaeda is all the same. It's all just violent extremism, except this extremism is driven by a particular cultural and religious ideology.
I'll tell you, having family from Syria and seeing what's happening in Egypt, it's because this administration has an oversimplified approach to every country in the Middle East, is that it's one of two choices, either the secular fascism of Saddam Hussein, Mubarak, or Assad, or it's the Islamism, and they say that those are Democrats because they use elections and now they're becoming nonviolent. There is a third pathway. The majority of Muslims and other faiths in the Middle East don't want either fascisms. And until this administration has the courage to take the side of the people and say that ultimately they're going to help, the good guys on the streets begin an era of reform and have the Arab awakening truly be about liberty, they're going to continue to see it be a not an Arab Spring, but an Islamist winter in this death match between two different fascisms in the Middle East.
But there are lots of countries that elect leaders in elections that are not necessarily all that valid if you only have one person running or one person and a token candidate who everyone knows is going to be beaten. You can't call that democracy, even if that's your goal, simply because you've offered up an election and, wow, you have a new president of Iran, so it's a democratic society. No, it's not.
Well, Lars, you hit the nail on the head. even in the Bush administration, we were defining Iraq's democracy as the purple finger and all about elections. And slowly we're figuring out that we need a strategy of liberty, that democracy is not about three wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner, as they say. That democracy is about minority rights, about defending women's rights, and all the other aspects of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that majoritocracies will never honor. And this is a part of the policy and the doctrine that this president has not had. And we've called for the administration to have a liberty doctrine, and instead their doctrine has been one of avoidance and what I've called the Darwin doctrine, which is to let the most evil and corrupt win in the Middle East. And we see genocides unfolding in Syria, and we've seen now the replacement of the Brotherhood with probably Mubarak II in Egypt, and the Saudis continue to dominate, and Iran's rising. So this president has overseen really the loss of a Middle East that really had an opportunity in 2011 that we've sorely missed.
Dr. Jasser, tell me if I'm completely off base, but this is an administration that's constantly talking about gay rights, the rights of minorities, both religious and racial minorities in America and everything else. And they seem schizophrenic because at the same time, the president, used to sit down and break bread with the Sultan of Brunei. And at least that brand of Islam seems completely incompatible with a pluralistic society or a society that respects sexual minorities or religious minorities or women. More than half the population.
What a great point, because this is the hypocrisy. When Obama is scratching his head and wondering, why are his approval ratings worse than President Bush's when he's always talking about pulling out of Iraq and Afghanistan? Well, it's because they see us continuing to coddle their dictators. This imam may be close to the Brotherhood networks here in the West, but I can tell you the women's movements, the gay rights movements, the minorities can't stand him because his ideology is about misogyny, is about majoritocracy and Islamism. And this administration has different values here at home than they do abroad, and it paints a picture of America as being hypocritical, and that's not what the conservative movement's about. It's not what those who advocate for liberty are about. And until we recalibrate that, we're going to continue to have a failed foreign policy and continue to be viewed as a paper tiger that is not going to be in the game of reform in the Middle East.
I mean, this has got to put an awful lot of the president's allies in the House and the Senate and elsewhere in a real tough spot because, during Bush, of course, they never tired of reminding you that they thought he was not right when it came to women's rights or other issues. And even now they accuse Republicans of waging a war on women. And yet all of these, an awful lot of, and I know you want to fight for your faith, and I respect that. The problem is some practitioners of your faith are just, of Islam. And again, I'll bring up the Sultan of Brunei because the president has sat down, had his picture taken with a guy. Do you hear the president, beating the drum saying we ought to tell Brunei that they ought to change their domestic policies because stoning people for adultery or homosexuality, it does not exactly fit in with the Democrat Party.
And I think we're starting to see a crack in that ceiling where people like Jay Leno and others are waking up. Just look at the hypocrisy now. They are calling for the boycott on that hotel that the Sultan was funding, but that was, again, a small country with no military. It's not like the Saudis or the Qataris that Al Gore took $500 million from, and others that I think if they really started to unravel and unpeel that onion of hypocrisy that the left has, they'll realize that this is a battle for the long term, for ideologies, the promotion of freedom and liberty. And there's a documentary that the Clarion Project put together called Honor Diaries that the left so far has tried to suppress, and it's 9 Muslim women talking about their struggle for feminism all over the Muslim world. And even Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who participated, was prevented from getting her honorary degree at Brandeis because of this issue where the left said, oh, she's anti-Islam, when in fact she was simply talking about women's rights. And this is the issue where they are going to end up exposing their internal